DevOps Dispatch presents Voices from the Industry.
These are not paid actors.
All right, coming to you live here from the Red Hat Summit and Ansible Fest here in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm here with Stephen Watt. Stephen, how are you?
I'm good, thanks.
So, what do you do?
So
tell the kids.
Yeah, sure. I lead the office of the CTO at Red Hat, which involves the Emerging Technologies Group, our open source program office, and Red Hat Research.
So, very cool. There were some announcements today. I'd love to get your take on that. And then, since you're looking 1 to 3 years ahead, how that sort of presages what will be coming on in the future. So, a couple of things I heard that caught my attention. One was the developer hub.
Yes.
Throw another one, OpenShift AI, and there are a couple others in there. But yeah.
Yeah, so sure. Happy to tell you more about that. So the Developer Hub is really interesting. It's derived off an upstream project called Backstage. But
Out of Spotify.
Out of Spotify, yep. And it's got a great community behind it, which has been a bit of a challenge on some of these multi-cluster management open source projects. There's a lot of fragmentation. So it's really great to see a community with a lot of momentum behind it. But essentially, it allows you to have one place to manage everything that's going on with your service, from documentation to how you build it, to error reports, to remediating your errors, but also your deployment topology, so that you can kind of see, well, if some aspects of your app are running on this cluster versus that cluster, you get the full view. You can sort of drill in and sort of see everything that's going on, as well as set standards for your organization on various golden images and best practices that and policies that people have to follow to actually deploy their application.
So are these additional plugins and functionality, or is it more tailored to the Red Hat world, or what's the...
So with the open source project, you get a base set of functionality, especially around topology and sort of insights into your application, but that's the popularity. It's extensible. So there's a plugin library which you can then load into your infrastructure that your organization can use when you're building your applications. And in the same way like Operator Hub, right? You can kind of build your Backstage plugins or contribute them to the community. And then we'll have our Red Hat specific certified ones, but there's also the community ones.
Okay, so that's a good example of increasing development productivity. So I know that's a theme going forward, how do you see this playing out into the future?
Well, I think there's a couple of different dimensions to that. So, artificial intelligence is having a moment right now.
Oh yeah,
and
you can't swing a dead cat without sneering at AI.
Absolutely. And so, if you look at the chat GPT space, etc., like the actual core technology behind it is known as large language models. And so we've actually got an application of that within Ansible Lightspeed. The upstream name is Project Wisdom. But essentially...
And what is that?
So it's a machine learning model that's been trained across the Ansible Galaxy set of best practice playbooks.
And just to take a step back, for those who maybe aren't so familiar with Ansible, just a basic Ansible is?
Sure, yeah. So it's automation software. So basically it's think of it as a way of like running a script that is idempotent. And so basically that'll mean like it'll either fully successfully complete or not and roll back. And you can use it for automating your infrastructure and also sort of various aspects of deployments or upgrades, things like that. Productivity.
Yeah, big player in the developer tool chain.
Absolutely.
DevOps. So sorry, I just read.
No. So today, the previous world, you're the chef puppet space, right?
Salt.
Yeah, Salt. We're very familiar with this, been around for decades, but a lot of these things, they're hand curated. So, in Ansible playbook, you'd write out exactly all the different steps that need to happen to get to your desired end state. That obviously requires some ramp up and know-how on how to use these things. And what's interesting is these large language models, the way they've been applied to this, and it's trained on this, you can now sort of, same way with like ChatGPT in a conversational way, you can say, look, create some users for me in my LDAP registry, and the playbook will use the model and just create the playbook steps for you, right? And so your knowledge of how to actually do things is less, because the model will sort of do it
So
for you.
more abstraction, sort of, yeah.
And it creates more consistency because
Okay.
it's derived from the best practices. So that's really great because one, it just allows you to get a lot of things done a lot quicker. And then at the same time, once you have those models, so let's say you apply that model to create a playbook for, hey, I have a server that goes down. What steps do I need to do to bring it back up, right? It's a consistent set of steps. Well, there's also event-driven Ansible. So basically you can configure these playbooks to get kicked off in the event of an event. And so in an event of a failure event, you can have Lightspeed create you what needs to happen and then connect it on the event-driven architecture to just do self-healing sort of autonomic computing, which is also a big productivity gain.
Computing, wasn't that something from like
2000s, yeah, exactly.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So is old is new?
Yeah, exactly. And so you're getting developer productivity, but then also sort of operations productivity out of that piece too.
Cool. So obviously, Lightspeed, Ansible, AI. How does this affect the world of platform engineering and DevOps going forward? How do you see those movements, concepts unfurling as we go forward?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different. When I think of this, I think of pipelines. Okay, so historically, when we build applications, we've got a pipeline of all the different steps to like create the application, compile it, deploy it. So there's that aspect of it, but now we're increasingly using models within our applications. And so all the good stuff that we've got around building your application, deploying it as a container, serving it, we're now extending that to models. And so you can sort of integrate those inside the same pipeline. And then there's the aspect of securing it, right? So when we build software, it's full of dependencies, right? And even when we build models, they're full of dependency. Where are you getting your data from, that you're training on it, but then also sort of like your software that you're using to build the model, where are you pulling those dependencies from, just like normal software?
In the case of SBOMS, and that from that
absolutely,
or
yeah.
From Black Duck, from licenses, or
yeah, I wish that most of the industry used that level of rigor that you just described, but in reality, SBOMs are, pretty new concept. And
just to explain for our viewers at home, SBOMs?
Sure, it's a software bill of materials. So when I say to Barton, hey Barton, here's this product, and then Barton's like, cool, but it's binary, like where does it come from? It's like a recipe, like here's the cake, but what were the ingredients?
Right.
And so the SBOM will actually say, look, it uses this version of Apache HTTP server or whatever, and can point to the source, so you have the provenance of the application.
And it's almost like Russian dolls, right? Because some components within the application have components within the components, and then it gets complicated after a while.
And it can be hard to tell whether something is being subverted or not. And
by that you mean?
Like secure software supply chain issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we saw, everyone's quite familiar with the SolarWinds exploit, which sort of kicked off the response from the White House around supply chain security.
Yeah.
And so we're, SigStore is an upstream project created at Red Hat, which allows you to basically sign every piece of software, but also I'd say every software artifact. So whether it's like a discrete build or the actual pipeline that's used to produce a build, you can sign it and then put it on an immutable registry that people can then query and then say like, hey, I've got this hash of the software, who's it from, how much do I trust that person, right? So trust is an interesting part of, remember I said it came back to pipelines.
Right.
So you've got a new way of building pipelines that includes software and AI, right, and models, and then you've got to sort of sprinkle in, well, how much do I trust people that I'm getting my stuff to build inside my pipeline, and how can I do attestation, things like that. So that's a SigStore, and we have trusted registry at Red Hat, where you can sort of see these provenances of the software that we provide. So while we do it for containers, we've done it for RPMs, now we do it for containers, now we do it for models. And Red Hat Open Data Science is a sort of an earlier part of the product, which is based on Jupyter Hub, where people can, a lot of people are familiar with that as like a place like the Jupyter Notebooks, where you can build models, test them, sort of see sample sets produced, and then basically when you commit the model, it can get sucked into the pipeline through a GitHub trigger and help deploy your application. So it's sort of all connected together.
So I think one of the things I saw in the keynote was skills gap. And I don't know if it applies to this, but there's got to be, I guess the question I would have is, what does this mean for skills that people will need going forward? What will you need less of, and what kind of skills will you need more of?
I think, so it's a great point. And I think the trend that you see on how to address these is basically have that interface between the person trying to do something, the developer, and the technology be conversational. Right, so you see that in Lightspeed, you see it in ChatGPT, but using natural language to express what you want to get done, and then have that system close that gap. And a lot of like the things being automated, like roll back to what we used to do, just more philosophically. Like I'm learning a new open source project. I'm like, I type in Google, how do I do this? Stack Overflow, whatever. There's 3 or 4 examples. I look at it, figure out which one's the most credible. I'll try that, right? And that's the stuff that's just being automated now, right? So it's being, instead of going to randos on Stack Overflow, it's being trained on credible best practices that use your organization's environment variables, the standard policies, and then just delivering that. So I think that's the piece that's really helping close the skills gap. It's more broadly described as conversational intersections with automation.
Okay. And then, in there you mentioned open source. You said the open source office is under your purview. What do you see as the future of open source? I realize that's a super broad question.
Great question.
But
so I think it's a couple of different. There's two main themes there, right? So open source is sort of one in enterprise software. However, everything we've been talking about lately is not as much software, it's more machine learning models and things like that. And then, those models that are being built are primarily proprietary. So they're large black boxes that, it's sort of very similar to proprietary software, right? And so if you buy Oracle, your ability to have transparency and agency to get something changed in the Oracle release or something to that effect is primarily correlated to your relationship with Oracle and your ability to influence them. Whereas open source is different. If the particular vendor you're buying open source from is dragging their feet, implementing a patch or a feature, you can just go upstream, contribute it yourself, and it'll flow down in their next release.
Right? That's supposed to be how it works. Other times people say, I want this feature, but they're not willing to.
They're not willing to do it. But if they were, they do have the agency to do it. But yes. And so we need to get to that point now with machine learning and specifically models so I think the Hugging Face is an interesting upstream project where they have data sets and communities to create models and contribute. So you have that sort of like an evolution of like open data sets, but now it's like that plus models. And so that is a space we're paying quite close attention to and wanting to foster. To create transparency and agency for models and data the same way you get software. And then I would say the second theme is around managed services, right? So there's a trend in managed services now where we take a open source upstream project, so packaged software that you'd normally download, build, and deploy, and then putting a service interface around that and providing that as a managed service. And then the question is, well, you sort of lose the sort of value loop that you'd normally get with people deploying it and using it because all the work to do, take that packaged software and turn it into a managed service is kept proprietary. And so it's not getting contributed back to the project. And I think as an open source community, broader ecosystem, we are still trying to navigate how to do this. There's been a number of different experiments in the place. I don't think we've quite got there yet, but that's another place we're paying quite close attention to.
So you go out and talk to a lot of customers, talk about the future. What about those people who are, and I'm surprised, somehow I thought that everyone was okay with open source software and not worried about it. But I had at breakfast, I talked to a couple of folks who work at customer type places, and their higher ups are still scared of using open source. And so, which I understand, how do you, if you don't understand it, either consuming, ingesting it, or donating code, which is probably scarier because, well, both are scary because they don't want to give away IP, and of course you don't want to bring in malware or get sued. Are you coming across people like that, and how do you make them feel more comfortable?
I think, I think this is it's a great observation, and it leads to a more like targeted discussion around where is your point of differentiation. So the person that's feeling that, we're like, how do you differentiate yourself in your market? And it's, is it really your proprietary software? I mean, wouldn't you be able to double down on that thing that differentiates you if you could offload this, that, and the other to an open source community or a foundation,
right,
to be able to handle these things for you? And so often it's just the way we navigate that is through that sort of conversation. We do still encounter them, despite open source sort of winning, I think it just depends sort of your view on software. Is it a means to an end, or is it the way you differentiate? If it's the way to differentiate, you tend to, and it's also what industry vertical you're in.
Right.
Like in enterprise software, all the latest and greatest stuff is coming from open source.
Right.
Like Ray is the latest distributed, analytics framework for machine learning, and that's yet another thing from the Berkeley labs, right? And so if you want to get access to that, you are sort of hyper-tuned to, okay, I got to look at open source first to get the best stuff. But if you're not in that industry, especially if you're closer to things that aren't software, like robotics or hardware, pure electronics, there's still they still hold intellectual property, trade secrets, that sort of thing very close to their heart, and they're still on that journey.
And then the other thing that I find there's a lot of misunderstanding about is what it takes to build a community. I know in some places I've worked before Dell, you take your software, you throw it over the wall, and boom, giant, rich community forms overnight. When you tell people, when people ask, say something like that to you, we got this great software we want to put out there and have a community built. How do you counsel them?
Yeah, you're so right. We have this saying at Red Hat, if people help you build the airplane, they won't try to shoot it down. And that is fundamentally the problem with taking a large piece of software and dropping it in the lap of some foundation and hoping people will form around it. You've got to sort of engage them in building the thing so they feel some ownership of the thing, because part of the value of open source is that you're sharing the load of maintaining the thing, right? You don't want to be the person holding the bag fixing all the bugs, right? You want to share that across the community. And so that is the first thing is we try and coach folks like, don't start with that huge code drop.
Right.
Start with here are my architectural principles that are immutable and can't change, that I want to base this approach on. Get some consensus on that, figure out, put your first layer of paint down on the actual implementation, and then build it together.
Would you say that governance is a big part of it from the beginning? In other words, is it always suspicious if you've got an open source project and all the people on the committers and all the maintainers are from XYZ company?
It can, depends on their reputation, and what they've done in the past. So there are a couple of different governance models. So you can look at the Apache Software Foundation that has, the project management committee approach, which is got some rules around, at least company diversity within that. And then you have other BDFL, or benevolent dictator for life kind of thing, which is
like Mark Shuttleworth and Ken Alfred and Ubuntu.
Yeah, and Linux and there are different models, and it just sort of depends the track record of the person or the people that are in charge. But generally speaking, you'll face less headwinds if you can start with a more collaborative, diverse leadership model. It can be as just 3 people, each from a different company, and that is an easier approach. You don't have to sell them, hey, you can trust me.
Right.
Yeah.
So just to end with, bonus question, anything that you see with Dell that you might be working on, or from your point of view, going forward?
Yeah, I think infrastructure, or just generally like business computing infrastructure, is in one of the most exciting times that we've had in a long time, right? I think there's been a lot of pressure that artificial intelligence and edge computing is putting on computational infrastructure, and needing different things from it than what we've had in the past. And so whether it's like CXL, which is sort of like arbitrarily programmable fabrics to assemble software, assemble what a server is from like a rack of just compute, memory, and storage, to offloading computation to increasingly exotic hardware, specifically to target accelerators, so I think that space is just really interesting. And then the last bit is like edge infrastructure, right? So it's just, if you think about like as businesses, ultimately we're going after customer satisfaction, right? Mm-hmm. And so if the customer is doing most of their interaction on this thing, and every time they're sending a request, it's going back to the mothership,
right?
It tends to be laggy and they don't have a great experience. So this is driving the push of like edge computing, where we can do more on that last mile closest to that end device. And that's creating very interesting opportunities for companies like Dell, I think, to come in and sort of create more infrastructure-based solutions that can sort of work out there on the far edge with intermittent connectivity, small footprint from a resource standpoint, low power.
We actually, at the booth, we have stuff that our companies are doing together with the edge and with telecom. Don't want to give it away we'll have to put a link to it in the notes.
Yes, yeah, that'd be great.
The other thing along these lines that you mentioned before we started, sounded really interesting, was programming at the edge.
Yes.
So explain that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a pretty emergent space. Just on the productivity side, we have a very pared down, lightweight version of OpenShift, which is our downstream of Kubernetes.
Would it be similar to a K3S?
K3S?
Yeah.
Conceptually very similar to K3S.
Okay. What do you call it?
It's called Microshift.
Okay, Microshift.
And so Microshift is designed to run on a far edge device. And basically the philosophy is, look, your IT department has been trained on, you made an investment teaching people how to build applications on OpenShift. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they didn't have to like go and learn something else completely different to deploy either a whole application or part of the service on the far edge? And so that's sort of the philosophy. Same approach to build applications, different deployment target, and then you can actually deploy a very lightweight application to run on the far edge, which would then serve your machine learning models that you've built through Red Hat Open Data Science. So you can do inference on the edge and things like that.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground,
yeah.
From the edge to the back end to Ansible to open source to security and SBOMS, and I don't know about you, but I've learned a lot. So with that, Stephen Watt, thank you so much.
Appreciate it. And if you want to learn more, check out next.redhat.com
or developer.dell.com.